dear friends. It's wonderful to see you all, and I see that you all made it safely to the UN Library. It's not always easy to find, but I see that lots of you have made it, so it's really wonderful to welcome you here. And I'd like first to thank the library and colleagues from this space for hosting us this afternoon. It really is a very special place to be. I think we'll all agree that it's a beautiful room, and I'd like to thank our colleagues from the library and the Commons for welcoming us. As you may know, the Commons is all about improving knowledge and sharing different methods of work. So they invited us today as the SDG Lab to see how we function in the different methodologies we use and what the So What series is all about. So this is the fifth iteration of the So What series. And we started 18 months ago. And the basic idea of this series was to say, okay, SDGs, interlinkages between all the SDGs, great, but so what? What does that actually mean in practice? We all talk about the paradigm shift of Agenda 2030, the integrated nature of the agenda, yet what we hear over and over again from member states and other stakeholders that are really active in implementation is that integrated nature doesn't just happen. It takes many different pieces of the puzzle to come together to allow for an integrated approach to actually land at country level. So what we've done in the past is that we've crossed two sort of unusual SDGs together, or SDGs that at a first glance may not be that related, to really understand through the views of practitioners what's the usefulness of actually crossing those two goals at policy and practice level. Today we'll be deferring slightly from that format, where we won't be actually looking at two specific SDGs, but we'll be really looking at the correlation, at the nexus, to use a word that's, in my view, overused, but the nexus between peace and development. As we like to say, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, is so much more than about development. It's about addressing the root causes that also bring us to conflict. It really is either a virtuous circle, or it can be turned into it's either a vicious circle or it can be turned into a virtuous circle. And today is about seeing how it can be turned into that virtuous circle. So the SDG Lab, just a few words. I have the privilege of heading this unit. It's a new unit. We're under 2 years old. For those who don't know us, I need that slide to be shifted right there. There we are. So we are what we call a connector or a convener, an amplifier, a question asker, and an innovator. And this series today, the So What series, is very much about our work related around being a connector, being an amplifier of practices that are demonstrating impact at country level. These 5 people will be illustrating that. But we're also about asking questions, and we all ask ourselves questions, but what we try to do in this So What series is to give you also the opportunity to interact directly with our panelists and really try and dig deeper into questions that we may not be able to ask in the same way in very formal settings. So this is an informal setting where all questions can be asked in a very sort of non-diplomatic way, if need be, and we found that this is something that is appreciated by different stakeholders, and I hope you'll appreciate it this afternoon too. I'd like to thank in particular the Peacebuilding Support Office for having partnered this afternoon with us. As a connector, we like to connect the Geneva ecosystem, but we also like to build bridges beyond Geneva, and today is an illustration of that, building a bridge with New York. As you know, the Peacebuilding Support Office is based in New York, in the UN headquarters, and we have the privilege of having our colleague here this afternoon representing that office. As we all know, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development commits UN member states to promote peaceful, just, and inclusive societies supported by the international community. And as the Secretary General's report on peacebuilding and sustaining peace states, I quote, "Inclusive and sustainable development is not only an end in itself, but also happens to be the best defense against the risks of violent conflicts," unquote. Violence and conflict represent some of the most challenging obstacles today to sustainable development. Nearly half of all people living in extreme poverty reside in countries affected by conflict. Peace and development, as we know, mutually reinforce each other, while violence and conflict can reverse development gains. So many drivers of violent conflict can be addressed through the SDGs, and for all countries, addressing inequalities and exclusion, improving natural resource management, making institutions more inclusive, and ensuring that the development strategies are risk-informed are central to prevention. So the 2030 Agenda and Sustaining Peace represent system-wide frameworks that focus really on the root causes of violent conflict and aim at building societal resilience. So they really are complementary and mutually reinforcing, and together are shaping a common global vision on a sustainable and peaceful future. The Secretary General also mentioned, I quote, "There can be no peace without sustainable development and no sustainable development without peace." So this synergistic relationship is what we're really going to explore today. And it's particularly important because, as you know, the peace goal, or SDG 16, will be reviewed this year at the high-level political forum. So we thought it was an opportunity today to give input, informal input, to this political debate that will happen in New York in July, and to really look at SDG 16 through the angles of many other SDGs and as they relate to the peace and development nexus. So this afternoon we have representatives from government. I have the pleasure here to have the special representative of the Kingdom of Jordan to the UN here in Geneva. We have a representative also of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who will be speaking to the nexus between gender and peace. I mentioned PBSO. We also have a representative of Chatham House, and Ollie, you'll be speaking very much of through the entry point, the sectoral entry point of conservation and peace. And last but not least, the ILO representative here, who will be focusing on the link between decent work and peace. So I thank you very much in advance for having joined us this afternoon. I'd just like to remind you that, are you already asking questions? You're faster than me. You can go on slido.com, and the code is 9646. For those who don't know the Slido website or application, it allows you to ask questions anonymously if you wish to, or you can also put your name if you'd like to, but it allows all of you also to vote for a question. If you feel it's a relevant question, you can just like it, and I'll make sure as a moderator that the questions that get most likes will be asked to our speakers this afternoon. Also, don't forget, if you'd like to tweet, if you can multitask, if you can listen and tweet at the same time, which I can't do, but I know a lot of you can, especially younger people. The hashtag is #SoWhatSeries, #Peace and SDGs, and #QuestionAsker. Okay, and don't hesitate also to follow the SDG Lab on Twitter. We like the idea of increasing a little bit our followers. All right, so on this note, I think I haven't forgotten anything. I'm just looking at my prompter, my senior colleague here, Kaylee, who often thinks for me. So I think I haven't forgotten anything. So on that note, I'd like to give the opportunity to Henk-Jan from PBSO to give us a few introductory remarks just on the general context that we're operating in when it comes to this nexus between peace and development, and how peace and peace building prevention also relates to the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. If you could give us a few words, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for organizing this, and thanks for coming and show your interest. I think we're facing a very difficult world at the moment, where the number of major conflicts have been increasing threefold over the last number of years, but also low-intensity conflicts have escalated. And actually, I think at the moment, violent conflict, I think, is the biggest obstacle to reaching the SDGs in 2030. In fact, some estimates state that by 2030 we will have more than 80% of the extreme poor living in conflict or fragile settings. And that is partly because the nature of conflict has been changing so much. The time of interstate conflicts has largely disappeared. The time that this building was built and the UN was founded, that was the main form of conflict, wars between countries. Then we had colonial wars of independence and civil wars, in particular during the Cold War, where the two major powers fueled usually one side of the conflict. But then subsequently, we have a much more diverse form of violence that goes from terrorism to violent extremism to gang violence to political violence. And it's much more amorphous and changing over time. And the motivations of what drives these conflicts is much more complex. And this, for example, means that the traditional instruments of the UN, in particular peacekeeping operations and mediation and facilitation and using the good offices of the Secretary General to negotiate a peace agreement, is much more difficult, much more complex. During the Cold War, we could just put two parties in a room and negotiate a peace agreement, put peacekeepers in between and implement a peace agreement, and that worked very well in Angola, Mozambique, Central America. But now we have many, many, many non-state armed actors. In Syria alone, there are over 1,000. So it's much more complicated to organize these negotiations and get actually a settlement. And the factors that are driving it has become very complex. It's not only about political and getting access to the political power in a country. It's also about economic resources, about natural resources, about water, about inequalities, and sometimes even the absence of livelihoods plays a role. And what that says is that we need a very comprehensive approach. So we cannot approach the conflicts of today with only military means or only political means to try to get a peace agreement. We need to look at these conflicts in a much more comprehensive way that looks at the UN system from all facets, from the human rights aspect, from the development side, from the peace and security side, from the political side, and from the development side. And that means that the entire UN system needs to be involved in peace building, and that is very clearly articulated in the resolutions that were adopted in 2016 as a result of the peace building architecture review. They were adopted simultaneously in the General Assembly and the Security Council. That has 4 really important elements that maybe for peace builders are not earth-shattering, but they were very important steps forwards for the UN. First, they recognize that peace building needs to happen before, during, and after conflict. So throughout the conflict cycle. It's not just post-conflict peace building anymore. Secondly, that you need comprehensive and coherent approaches that involves the entire UN system. That's explicitly in the resolutions. And third, you need to have national ownership. That's, of course, a mantra that has been repeated a lot. But what the resolutions added is that it needs to be inclusive and involving all stakeholders. And it needs to address the needs of all segments of the population, which is a very important phrase in my view, and very much is linked to the leaving no one behind phrase that is central to the 2030 agenda. And then the final element is about partnerships. The UN is never alone. The UN is rarely the biggest, although where we have big peacekeeping operations, such as in Central African Republic, we are the biggest operator. But in many other countries, in most other countries actually, we are not the biggest operator. So we need to work with partners. Also for a reason, because of this comprehensive nature of conflict that needs to involve so many different actors, civil society, the private sector, regional organizations, neighbors, international financial institutions. And those are all explicitly mentioned in the resolutions that we need to form coalitions around to make sure that we really create peaceful just and inclusive societies over the longer term. Maybe I will say there's one more thing about this relationship between peace and the Sustainable Development Goals. Nadia already mentioned a couple of the high-level phrases of the mutual reinforcing nature, etc. But it's very clear is that the causality running one way. If you have war, if you have violent conflict, it really affects everything in society. It causes death, displacement, disease, and it has very long-term consequences. It's really development in reverse. But it also works the other way. There are also many factors in the development goals that drives violent conflict, as I mentioned before about the comprehensive nature. We know that inequalities has become a very important factor, and especially horizontal inequalities between groups, especially when they can be grouped around identity. And political entrepreneurs take advantage of that to create these groups based on identity. That's what Milosevic did in Yugoslavia. Nobody was talking about the battle in 1348, I think it was, until Milosevic started talking about it again. So that is very important, horizontal inequalities. And in fact, a lot of the peace, inclusive, and just societies is not just in Goal 16, it's throughout the agenda. New York University identified actually 36 targets in the entire 2030 agenda that either relate to peace, to justice, or inclusivity. So Goal 4, an indication, talks about peace education. Goal 5 is on gender equality, talks about violence against women. Goal 8 is about jobs and safe jobs. Goal 11 talks about safe cities. Goal 10, of course, is about inclusion. And then, of course, you have the natural resource goals, 13, 14, and 15, that is so critical. And then finally, there are a couple of elements that are really common between these two agendas, the Sustaining Peace agenda and the Sustainable Development agenda. First is that concept that it's really trying to reach everyone, leaving no one behind, and reaching the furthest behind first. And secondly, both are very people-centered. And I think it's very important that the Charter of the UN not starts with countries, but it starts with we the people. The UN is here for the people of the world. And thirdly, there is a strong emphasis both in the Sustaining Peace Resolution and in the Sustainable Development Agenda that there are strong interlinkages between these concepts. We cannot live in, the problems are not in silos. The UN, people don't live in silos. We cannot address these problems in silos. And finally, and last but not least, it's the state's primary responsibility to reach this agenda, to create peaceful, just and inclusive society and reach the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henk-Jan. And I think, you know, we say that we should all break silos, that everything's interconnected, that different stakeholders are interconnected, yet when we speak, we very much still speak about the sort of peace-building community, the development community, right? So we're not totally there yet, right? But I think you did a really good job at demonstrating why we should be talking about one single community, and above all, your point that a person, right, doesn't kind of change in terms of its livelihoods or in terms of its aspiration for access to services, etc. It's the same person, whether that person is in a stable context or suddenly finds himself or herself in a conflict-affected context. So it's not that we can suddenly say, okay, you change now, we need to address you through this lens, right? It remains the same person. And I think we all know that in theory, but in practice, it's not always that obvious. And we also have institutions and structures that sometimes prevent us from actually breaking those silos. But thank you for bringing up that notion also of the importance of a systemic approach, both in the peace-building context, prior, during, and after. The systemic approach, or this comprehensive approach, which you mentioned, is very much at the core also of the SDGs. So I think we really are speaking the same language. And we hope that we'll be back here in a few years or in a few months and no longer have this distinction between both those communities. I'd like now to give the floor to Maria. Maria Butler is the Director of Global Program for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And today, Maria, we're very happy to have you here to talk to us a little bit more about peace through the entry point of SDG 5, of gender equality. What does gender have to do with peace? What does gender have to do with conflict? And for that matter, how does gender have to do with finding solutions to conflict-affected regions? So I'd like to give you the floor for just a few general introductory remarks, and then we'll have an opportunity to really dive into some concrete questions. Maria.
Thank you, Nadia. Actually, when you were speaking, I was thinking of the foremothers of WILPF. They met in 1915. And they were suffragettes fighting for the vote, but also they said, not only do we want to vote, we want to have our voice and analysis about the First World War. And what they did then was talk about the root causes of the conflict, and it only took the UN 100 years to adopt the Sustaining Peace Agenda, but they would, I think, be very excited about it if rigorously implemented. And I think that's the key, is to talk about how the concept of sustaining peace and addressing root causes can be implemented by civil society, by member states, and by the UN agencies. For WILPF, through our analysis and link to conflict, as a women's organization, it has been about addressing exclusion, and you touched very much on this: political, economic exclusion, the issue of militarism, how militarism as a thought, but also as a system of economics, drives the conflicts and our war economy today. It's not only talking about the inclusion of women in peace processes as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda demands, but also looking very much at women's voice and analysis in all the issues that are in the SDGs and indeed the Sustaining Peace Agenda. What I've learned from the women activists in our community is certainly that war doesn't stand alone. It's part of a continuum of violence, and peace is not the absence of war. There are many more aspects, and what they talk about is also the scale of violence, whether it's nuclear weapons or whether it's violence in the home. The continuum between violence that individual women face, and we all know this from the Me Too movement, that there is no barriers, there's no industry that violence against women doesn't touch. There's no gender norms in the West or in other parts of the world. Patriarchy exists in all of our societies and affects women and men as a system of exclusion. What I've also learned is that gender certainly is part of the continuum, and all parts of the continuum, how men and women's lives are expected to be, how femininity and masculinity is expected by society, touching on the core of social norms. And the human rights system has a huge role to play in both prevention of conflict and addressing root causes, but also non-discrimination and gender equality as laid out in the SDGs. One of the strongest research findings, and there's been so much research around the links with violence and gender, has been that political violence in our societies is much more based on equality. Where there's more equality, there will be more peaceful societies. And a lot of documentation has been in place around how we can move forward to address the barriers that we all face in coming about the equality. For WILPF, I was reading a quote over the weekend around the economic system, and it said something like 8 men own the same amount of wealth in the world as 3.6 billion people. 8 men own the same amount of wealth as 3.6 billion people. And I was thinking, for the women's movement, it's not about having 4 women and 4 men owning the same amount of wealth as 3.6 billion. It's about changing the system of economic exploitation and inequality. That is what feminism analysis is about. So the focus on gender equality is critical, but it's not about adding women to the same system. It's about how can we reform this system. And indeed, in 1919, the women of Wilf said those things. They said there should be no transport of luxury goods around the world until everyone has food. They already had the analysis within the feminist movement. So this, I think, joined up thinking really exists already in how we look at the intersection of lives and systems of power. I think I should stop there.
Thank you very much, Marie. We'll come back to you anyway later. But thank you also for underscoring again, I think Henk Jan also mentioned it in his introduction, the notion of inequality in all its different shapes and forms, how much of a driver it is to conflict. But also if you flip it the other way, how much of an enabler it is for peace. And I think you made that pretty clear, and we can have a conversation around that afterwards too. I'd like to give the floor now to Ollie Brown. Ollie is an associate fellow, part of the Chatham House in the Energy, Environment and Resource Programs. And Ollie, thank you very much for joining us today. Your entry point will be through conservation. So what does conservation have to do with peace? And how do we kind of move forward also in conflict prevention by really taking a close look at the lens of conservation? So you have the floor for about 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. By way of slightly depressing introduction, one of the things I just wanted to sort of use to set the context for my remarks is that we have this major challenge of a loss of biodiversity, which is perhaps an equal challenge with climate change and with peace. We're seeing rates of extinction that are between 1,000 and 10,000 times over the historical averages. We're seeing a loss of 80% of insects in some places in Europe, loss of 40% of amphibians under threat of extinction, 1/3 of corals under threat of extinction. And I'm saying this because this is not just about the direct numbers of biodiversity and the numbers of species there are, but that has very real impacts on the abilities of humans to live on the planet. It has an impact on pollination, our ability to grow food, our ability to be resilient as a community. And so it really sort of gives us two questions. We're losing biodiversity already. So how much is enough to lose? That's the first question. And what do we do about conserving the remainder of that? So we have these two huge questions that are facing us as a species. And the link between conservation and conflict, I think there are many different links. But I would just pick out three. The first Henk Jan talked a bit about already, which is natural resources, biodiversity resources already fund violence, fund conflict around the world. The illegal trade in wildlife is the 4th biggest illegal trade in the world after the trade in drugs, people, and arms. So it's directly fueling that conflict. Since 1990, 18 different conflicts, civil wars, complex conflicts like Henk Jan was talking about have been directly funded by the illegal trade in natural resources and things like timber and so on. In Eastern Congo, there's a strong incentive for continued conflict with the dozens of different armed groups that are operating in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo because people can make money out of the illegal extraction of wildlife, timber, mineral resources. So there's a direct link between the way we manage our resources and the funding for conflict. The second link, I think that is really important, is that the environment, biodiversity is also a silent victim of conflict. We saw in Syria, in Iraq, under ISIS, massive damage to the environment, oil being released directly into the environment, oil wells put on fire. Ever since, there's been many examples of where the environment has been used as a weapon of war, scorched earth policies to either defoliate jungle areas, as was the case with Agent Orange in Vietnam, or with Saddam Hussein withdrawing from Kuwait to fire the oil wells to create cover as they withdrew. So the environment gets used as a direct instrument of war. Now that's important because the people who've suffered under the conflict still have to rebuild their lives in that environment. It complicates the humanitarian challenge. It leaves long-run toxic legacies that people have to deal with that makes the humanitarian challenge of peace building and sustaining peace more difficult and leaves a kind of legacy for future generations to deal with. And the third point is a much more positive one, is that we all share an environment, we all share water, land, we all breathe from the same atmosphere. There's a strong interest that communities, that countries have to work together to protect their environment. And so, in a previous life, I was with UN Environment, and in UN Environment, we saw time and again that the environment could be a mechanism for people coming together. You can discuss your shared water, you can discuss shared common environmental challenges, and sometimes you can put the politics to one side. We share this river, we share this atmosphere, we share this transboundary wildlife, so you have to collaborate over managing that. And time and again in UN Environment, we saw that that's an entry point for different people, different communities to come together to agree on something, even if they don't agree on everything.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ollie. And I think we could have had a sort of classic So What series just on those correlations and linkages, and also with what Maria has just said before. And thank you very much for highlighting how, the direct link to stability or instability in a country, depending on how resources are managed or mismanaged, but also the opportunity that exists today with so many resources being cross-boundary, of actually working together to ensure more stability, not only in a country, but in a whole region. And I think this is actually a beautiful and natural transition to you, Ambassador. You're here this afternoon to share with us the experience of Jordan and the experience of linking up water and the management of water resources and stability in a country and a region. Could you maybe give us a 5-minute intro on your experience at the level of your country? You have the floor, Ambassador.
No, thank you very much. Just to say that speaking about SDGs and SDG 6 specifically, and on water and on peace, without going into the experience of my country, I will basically shed some light on it as we go on through the debate. Just to say that SDG 6 or water was and access to water and access to sanitation was recognized as sustainable development goal, but that goal itself basically is linked with so many other goals, whether it is goal 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We were just talking about gender equality, or whether we talk about the rest of the goals. It's intrinsically linked also with human dignity and human rights, because scarcity in this in water would actually lead to threat to life, threat to health, threat to food security. It actually affects all of our lives. It affects education, because if you don't have sanitation, it would probably affect a small girl from going to school, and so on and so forth. And at a more general level, globally, it has been it has been made actually clear that the global water resource itself is on the decline, and this itself is a problem. And the World Economic Forum itself came to or ranked the water crisis as one of the most worrying crises in the world. Number one worrying crisis that is. And so this, what it does is that probably would amplify the potential for conflict for this right. But when we speak about peace in general, in relation to this right, we speak at peace at different levels. We speak at peace at the regional level, and we speak at peace at the local, national, and community levels. And both are quite different, but we have to work on both ways. When we speak at the, and both are also linked with human security and the freedom from want and their relations also with other rights. So when we speak about, let me go to somehow explain this further. Around the world, it has been acknowledged, especially with countries that have shared water resources, that, and there are quite a number of examples, that there is a need to cooperate together on the management of these finite resources, because, as we say, they are decreasing. This, unfortunately, has not been the case in the Middle East, where today we are plagued with a number of crises. So that have triggered displacement. We have conflicts that have gone unsettled. We have a civil war in Syria. And elsewhere. We have the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, occupation in the Golan and in the occupied Palestinian territories. We have climate change, which is on the rise, and as I said, dwindling resources. So, and despite of this, basically, we have not been able to use water as an instrument towards more cooperation and peace. So what does this basically result in? It has resulted in a continued deficit of rights in certain areas, like the occupied Palestinian territories, where there is no, where the dispute has not been settled to date. But it has also led major countries sharing the same basins. The fact is that most of the countries share the major basins in the Middle East, rivers and tributaries and groundwater. They have not either been able to basically come to terms to cooperate. And what has this resulted in? It has resulted in the possibility for non-state actors, for terrorists and armed groups at one point or another, basically to take hold of water resources. We have seen this in Mosul and Fallujah in Iraq. We have seen this in Syria with the Tabaqa and Tishrin dams earlier on, and they have actually made their say. But the use of water basically as an instrument of war in itself is illegal in international law and international humanitarian law, as well as unethical. Non-state actors, however, you cannot really have a say on these actors. So what we need to do really at that international, regional level, especially that the Middle East, and I speak specifically of the countries that are surrounding Jordan and close to Jordan, are either arid or semi-arid regions, and they depend when there is drought basically on the shared resources that are there for each other. We need to come to an agreement to manage these water resources in a way that benefits all on the one hand, and we need to also know that the decision making we make on each and every individual in this region on managing these water resources affects the other in one way or another. And there is, but we also need to know that there is great potential to work together on and to collaborate for the sake of peace and prosperity in the region. And probably, Jordan, just to say in this regard, we signed a peace agreement in 1994 with Israel, and we allocate an agreement that allocates in its Article 6 rightful allocations of water to both sides and to the different rivers as well as groundwater. And have a joint committee for water that has met and have acknowledged that the fact that the water resource is very little, that we have to come up with other ideas to rely on the international community and regional projects to support potential for development of water resources in this regard. And for example, the Red Dead Conveyance project is one project that allows for cooperation and inclusion and access to water to all, basically to Jordan first and foremost, but it allows also the Palestinian Authority to receive water as well as Israel. And we are still yet, after 20 years, still working on phase 1 of operating and coming to implement on implementation of this agreement. Probably at a later stage, I can talk more about what Jordan specifically has done, but I agree with everything that has been said on the importance of inclusion and equity and equality when it comes to making use of the SDGs, and here I speak specifically of water, is very important both at the level of the human being, the individual, but also at the level of the state itself, as well as the communities within the states.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And indeed, I think, like other speakers, your whole introduction really pointed to this, to one of those major drivers of conflict and instability being inequality and being the lack of inclusion, be it through the entry point of gender, be it through natural resources, be it through water, all the challenges related to that, but also the great opportunities, considering that we're all equally struggling with the scarcity of natural resources, and that we have a vested interest in working together as people. We all need that basic resource, not only to survive, but also to be able to go to school and to be able to have a livelihood, which allows us to have access to food, etc. And so goes on the integrated nature of the agenda. But it is striking to see, to me, already at this early point of the conversation, how this message keeps coming back from all of you, the notion of inequalities being the drivers, really, of instability and conflict. And I think we all know that in the back of our heads, but I find it very interesting to see you articulating it through those examples. I'd like now to give the floor to Federico Negro from the International Labour Organization. Thank you for joining us. Federico, tell us a little bit more, based on your experience, how much access to work and to decent work has an influence either on creating instability and potential for conflict, or if you flip it around, how it can be a great enabler also for preserving peace in a country. You have
Yes, thank you very much, Nadia, and good afternoon. Let me start by saying that we are in 2019. and it's our centenary, the centenary of the International Labour Organization. I'm saying so not for promotional purposes or to praise my organization, but because I want to I reminded myself and communicate to you that the International Labour Organization has been founded in 1919 with the purpose of promoting peace. Precisely because there is room, there is a role that peace, employment, work plays in the reconstruction, in the post-conflict environment. That was a post-conflict environment. But as it has been said earlier by colleagues, nowadays conflict is not only working in post-conflict. So the role of the employment and decent work is in any situation that has some form of fragility. For this purpose, for this reason, rather, the members of the ILO in 2017 came up with a new recommendation, which is the recommendation number 205, employment and decent work for peace and resilience. And this recommendation, it's a normative framework that precisely tries to answer the question. So what is the ILO role? What is actually the employment and decent work role? Not the ILO only, because it's the role of everybody, all organizations involved in livelihoods and decent work and employment creation, in maintaining peace, so a direct role in the sustaining peace agenda, but also how this can then translate in joint initiatives such as Sustainable Development Agenda. So this recommendation provides us all some precise guidelines, some principles, but also in what to do. You know, here we say, so what? So what we can do to promote employment and peace and work and decent work to strengthen the peace, or in fragile situation, trying to maintain the peace and the conditions. So there is a lot of work that can be done in these kind of settings, but you know, we have, or at least we had the tendency, you know, before we all talk about the humanitarian development nexus, of thinking about this kind of intervention to come, you know, when the conditions are there. Instead, the recommendation and back the UN policy of the 2009 said very clearly that all opportunities are good opportunity to invest in peace in the, as far as livelihoods and employment are concerned. So this should start in the humanitarian phase, investing the humanitarian resources to make as much as possible the recovery sustainable. Again, I'm talking in terms of employment and decent work. This one relates extremely well in the strengthening institution purpose. So it's not only substituting ourselves to maybe very weak institutions in countries, especially in protracted crisis, but really trying to work from day one, or at least as soon as possible, in strengthening those labor-related institutions. I'm thinking about vocational training systems, about ministries, about employers' organization, the private sector, Chamber of Commerce, that can invest themselves in the creation of employment opportunities, as well as the workers' organizations, because they, even in some cases, may be weak. They represent the needs of the workers, and are the voices of the workers that they are passed through them. So, from one side, working in the upstream, strengthening the capacities of labor-related institutions. From the other side, providing what we all call the peace dividends, because especially in very fragile situation or in post-conflict this time, it's important to give people opportunity of peace in terms of incomes, in terms of access to opportunity for enhancing their employability and so on. Last thing, I think it's also very important to consider in this time that we are living in, the role that we all play and some specific institutions play in access to labor market for displaced population. This is another aspect where many organizations are paying a lot of attention, and this is, again, goes back to our theme today of equality, so equal access not only to jobs, but also to decent work, which is something that in the longer term can allow to also tackle one of the root causes of the conflict, one of the conflict drivers, which is lack of access to proper job opportunities. So avoiding the exploitation, avoiding very low salary, very poor working conditions, and so on, that ignite the conflict in some situations as well.
Thank you very much, Federico, also for shedding light on that entry point and how important the access to work is on the stability of a country and a region. I think we touched on so many of the core necessities of a human being to be able to thrive in life, and the correlation, the direct correlation with a stable or unstable context. So is it that, hearing all of you, is it that we shouldn't have called this agenda the 2030 development agenda, but should we have just called it the 2030 peace agenda? Is it that if we were to reach every single SDG and every single target in every single country of the world, would there be any reason for war or not? That's an open question I'd like for you to all think about, and maybe Henk-Jan, you'd like to react to that?
Yeah, in principle that's possible, but I think a lot of these things, the absence of jobs, especially for young people, water resources, natural resources, can be a source of conflict, but it can also be a source of war. And it's a lot about how you do it. There are basically three ways to manage conflict, which is inherent in all societies and all human interaction, to manage conflict in a non-violent way. One is through a political system where you negotiate and develop compromise and policies that everybody, or at least the majority in parliament, can adhere to. The second is the judicial system, where if you have a conflict, you can get access to justice and settle a dispute. And the third is violence. And if you, as Federico said, you need institutions to manage conflict in a non-violent manner. And if those institutions are there, then you can have more peaceful societies. Botswana had a lot of natural resources, but it has been a very peaceful country. Diamonds, but in Sierra Leone had diamonds, and the DRC had diamonds, and it really, in Angola, talking about that war, was very much fueled by diamonds. So it is about the institutions can manage these benefits in a peaceful manner and in an equal and equitable manner. So natural resources lead to a lot of resources. And how they're distributed in a transparent manner through political systems, it will critically determine whether you would create a peaceful society or not.
So we come back to this notion of equality, right? The way resources and access is given to all or not to all.
It's a very critical factor.
I'd like to, there's a few questions on Slido that I would like to pick up on, but I'd like to give all of you the opportunity also to react. You're not so much on your phones, which I always think is good. It means that you're interested in the conversation. And if you're on your phones, maybe you're on Twitter. Don't forget to tweet if you can multitask. But I'd like to give the opportunity to anyone who'd like to take the floor at this stage to ask a first question to the panelists to be able to do so. Any requests for the floor at this stage? Yes, please. And if you could just identify yourself, and maybe stand up and ask your question. Thank you. Oh, maybe let me give you a mic. There you go.
Thank you so much. My name is Jasmine Moussa from the Permanent Mission of Egypt. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their really informative and very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. I'd like to pick up on what the permanent representative of Jordan was talking about, SDG 6, and access to water. In Egypt, we have a situation where we're a very water-scarce country. About 96% of our water comes from outside of the Egyptian boundaries. So we share a watercourse, the Nile Basin, with 10 other countries. And my question is really, should we not be focusing on prevention? So when we have this debate, and we talk about using water resources in an equitable manner, what is equitable is really highly subjective. So what happens when what is equitable for one state will inevitably cause harm to another state? And should we, and here when I'm talking about harm, I mean loss of livelihoods, loss of agricultural land, what is really very tangible harm. So shouldn't we really be focusing more on prevention, on having robust frameworks that can really allow states to invest more into finding alternatives and mitigating measures, to invest into joint studies that look into the harmful effects of certain utilization of a shared transboundary water resource? What can be done to make sure that we prevent the conflict from happening?
Thank you very much. So the question of prevention, what can be done to prevent inequalities in a country, in a region, and at global level? I'd like to take a few more questions, if there are any. No, otherwise I'd like to take one of the questions that's on Slido, related to the human rights dimension, because many of you have found this question interesting. So how should we practically integrate human rights in the SDG framework? And there was one a little bit more precise, if you can just go up or down. Hello? No, go up, please. Thank you. Okay, so down. There was one that phrased it in a different way, which I found was helpful. If you could go down. Yes, on human rights. Yes, how can we leverage human rights instruments to sustain peace, or to prevent conflict? That was a question that had a lot of likes. Would anyone like to react to that question, or to the questions from the floor? Maria? Ooh, I have a double mic thing going on here. I don't need.
Yes, I'll share maybe just how we're doing using the human rights mechanisms, and then others can pitch in the room. So one way we use both the treaty body system and the universal periodic review system is to ask questions of states, and ask other states to ask questions and recommendations, or put forward evidence to the treaty bodies about women, peace and security, and militarism, arms trade. Why is a country continuing to sell arms to a country where there's widespread systematic human rights abuses? And to use the human rights system to link up with the arms trade treaty obligations of state parties, and to the women, peace and security agenda commitments. So where a country has a national action plan on women, peace and security, they're committed in different ways to include women in peace processes and political discussions. So we use the human rights mechanisms to ask questions of those states and states parties to treaties to ensure that they uphold their human rights obligations and include women in national processes, and also where they're involved in international processes. Syria is an example where we used the UPR recently. Cameroon, DRC are also currently under review. Thank you very much. Henk-Jan, you wanted to react to that, and then Ambassador. And then
yeah, two maybe points about both Ambassador's point. You know, water wars have been predicted for decades, and they really haven't occurred. And actually, the history of collaboration around water, in particular at the international level, is very good. Ambassador from Jordan talked about the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, and I'm sure there are plenty of rooms for improvement, in particular water and sanitation access in the occupied territories. But the agreement around the sharing of the resources that are there has worked to the extent that it hasn't led to a war. And that has been the case actually throughout history. In the Mekong Delta during the Vietnam War, around the deltas in South Asia between India and Pakistan, also around the Nile River. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no conflict. Of course there is conflict, and there's very important conflict that needs to be solved. But there are institutions to talk about these conflicts and to settle them and solve them. I totally agree that equitable is a subjective term, and that is exactly why these negotiations and these talks need to take place, so that there can be a common understanding of each other's perceptions around the sharing of water resources. Now, part of the problem is that at the subnational level, these institutions don't exist. So that's why you have conflicts between farmers and herders in the Sahel and in Somalia and in Sudan. And that's why the Peacebuilding Fund invests in creating some of these mechanisms to make sure that there are institutions that can address these conflicts. And of course, we need to do much more in using less water, in particular in agriculture, drip irrigation, more crop per drop. It's clear that with 10 billion people and limited amount of fresh water resources, we need to do much better at sharing the resources that we have. On the human rights aspect, the question from Slido, you know, the human rights are actually integrated throughout the 2030 agenda. I was involved both in the discussions around the SDGs, but also around the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals took years to get the human rights community on board because they felt that human rights were not well reflected. In the Sustainable Development Goals, there were so intense discussions and negotiations for 4 or 5 years, where the human rights actors and a lot of other communities were able to talk about the human rights aspect, that they, from day one, they were totally on board, and they have always argued that the SDGs are fully based on human rights, even if the word human rights doesn't appear so much. But the issues of discrimination, the issues of equalities, access to justice, they're all in the SDGs. Equalities, the freedom from want, I think the ambassador mentioned, the freedom from want and the freedom from fear is the 2 principles that is driving the 2030 agenda. And those are the basic human rights that everybody needs.
Thank you very much for that. Ambassador, you have the floor, followed by Ollie.
Thank you very much. The question on prevention is very important, and I sort of referred to it earlier on, just to since the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory was just mentioned, just to say that how difficult the situation is. In fact, the situation is dire as the resources since 1967, water resources, that is, since 1967, 90% of them have not been under the control of the Palestinians, as well as in Gaza. Yes, Gaza has been prevented from rebuilding its sewage systems. Unfortunately, it's very difficult, let alone what's happening in the Golan with respect to restrictions on the right of use of water, having to buy their own water, and the restrictions that are being imposed by the occupying force. At another level, unfortunately, yes, there have not been any wars, but there has not been any trust or confidence to actually get concerned countries to sit together on the table and work out differences that would allow to use the common share of water they have for peaceful uses, for development that will allow development and welfare of the region as a whole. This has not taken place, but there is always the potential for it to take place, either through the regular course of settling disputes agreements that has examples of things that are successful, as I just stated, to the agreements that have been signed by Jordan, specifically the peace agreement with Israel, and then other agreements, an agreement with Syria on the Yarmouk Basin, an agreement with Saudi Arabia on the use of the groundwater waters in the DC area, joint aquifer between both our countries. But in other cases, it has not been so. And so what this means is that probably we should look outside the box and see whether we can bring people in a very informal sort of way together. And there have been initiatives at the international level that allow for things like this. The Blue Peace community, for instance, is one example where practitioners from all over the world, more than 200 parliamentarians, leaders, decision makers, technicians, all sit together and think of how they can solve and bring proposals to solve problems in this regard. There's also the Global Observatory on Peace and Water, which is Geneva-based, that has been working, I think, since 2017, that is trying to push an agenda of initiatives also in this regard. And the high-level panel on water and peace and the report that came out on basically water as a matter of survival, all point out to the potential of what informal networks through dialogue that bring about the different practitioners from the region can do to work out best practices on how to manage water resources and to divert them towards peace and equal shares and so on and so forth. On the other issue with regarding to integrating human rights in the sustainable development framework, what we have done in Jordan is incorporate the civil society from a very early start in the planning and in the writing of our report, and including them also in the implementation phases. We have different mechanisms at the national level, one ministerial group that now has two different working groups. One on gender equality that is under the lead of our National Commission for Women, which is actually mainstreamed in all 18 sectoral committees that are working on the implementation. And one other committee, human rights, to ensure that human rights aspects are taken in, and it is under the lead of our National Center for Human Rights. And gender equality, as I said, has been mainstreamed, and civil society actually participated both in the drafting of our report as well as in presentation of our VNR, Voluntary National Report, in 2017, and are active partners in the implementation process at the national level, ensuring that all our national plans, strategies, and programs are in line with our human rights commitments, as well as with the SDG, and that the SDG plan is aligned with our human rights commitments, and B, that the human rights are actually well integrated and embedded in our implementation. That's just a small example of what we are doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to give the floor now to Ali. You wanted to react to some of these questions, maybe on prevention of inequalities, or maybe you had another
Two
comment.
things, just very quickly. I think our colleague from Egypt, you're absolutely right. The issue is around prevention. And to pick up on what Henk Jan said, I thought it's a really good way of describing the reason that something doesn't turn violent is either because you have a political system or a judicial system to resolve it. And maybe part of the confusion is a problem with language, is we talk about conflicts being everything from a dispute where you have a disagreement with somebody, all the way up to violent conflict. So disputes happen everywhere, all the time. Everybody has disputes. It's only a problem when they turn violent. They turn violent in the absence of a political system or a judicial system to settle that dispute. Now, in the case of the Nile Basin Initiative, which you'll know a lot more about than I will, has been a political attempt to resolve a dispute over the shared waters over the Nile. And obviously, as you're saying, that's a very different interpretation of what is equitable in terms of the sharing of that water. But that's why peacebuilding starts before conflict. It starts during conflict and carries on after conflict, so that you build that prevention into the system. I think that's really important. The second point on human rights and using human rights as a way of pursuing this agenda, 150 countries have made a constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment part of their constitutions. So 150 different countries have basically said that having a clean environment is a human right. So people who are defending that are defending our collective human rights. Now the question is, the problem is, again, one of language, is that when we talk about conservation, people think, oh, that's lions and elephants and safaris and large areas and so on. But that's what I was trying to get at when I was talking about, in my introduction, about it being the conservation of the diversity of life on our planet and how much we, collectively as a species, are willing to lose of that diversity.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Before I take, I know Federico, you wanted to react, but just a reminder, so also there are representatives from different organizations. You're all practitioners in the room, from academic backgrounds to non-governmental organizations to member states to different, you represent different stakeholders. So don't hesitate to share also your experiences in terms of how you're tackling these issues that we're discussing this afternoon, be it in tackling inequalities, be it on addressing prevention, but also looking at all the inequalities through all the its different forms and shapes, right? I think this afternoon we have, in a way, we talk about silo breaking, and yet each and one of you has kind of looked at the issue through one lens, right? So I think I'd like a conversation afterwards on, okay, that's great, but that's not enough. A human being, right, represents many different, or has very different needs, and you can't indeed look at a human being only through one silo. So how do you tackle that at country level to ensure that you have an integrated approach to inequalities also, to make sure that, I mean, it's not enough to have access to education if then you don't have access to health, for example, or water, etc. So just a thought, I'd like to discuss that afterwards, and if there are any partners in the room who'd like to react to that, we'd be interested in that. But first, I'd like to give the floor to Federico.
Yeah, thank you. I'll continue to see to tackle those issues from our point of view, the point of view of the world of work. And it is worthy to mention, the centrality of the international labor standards. In order to promote peace, we of course need to provide income opportunities, jobs, I would say decent jobs, but also the promotion of the international labor standards. The fundamental principles of right at work that are not present oftentimes in situations of conflict or protracted fragility. I'm thinking of forced labor, child labor, worst form of child labor, including child soldiers, or lack of freedom of association. So it's by bringing those thematic issues of the world of work that we can contribute to the sustaining peace agenda. Hand in hand and together with very practical provision of income opportunities, job opportunities. And doing so, not again in isolation, but and to answer to your last question, this can be done by empowering our colleagues in the UNCT, taking advantage of the UN country team, sorry, taking advantage of the UN reform as well, but ensuring that this is done from day one with the local institution. Do we want stronger institution promoting peace as per SDG 16? Then we have to do it. And these are good opportunity of promoting this kind of international labor standards that have very direct consequences on people's life, and definitely, if implemented and respected, they contribute to the peace building.
Thank you very much. Any reactions from the floor? I saw a few hands. Yes, you have the floor. Let me just come to you. Sorry, I'll pass you the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Francesca Fraccaroli. I'm here, based here in Geneva with OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. In fact, my question is pretty much related to the humanitarian part of the response. So you have been very clear in articulating all the other silos, the other component on tackling a conflict, the peace building aspect, the work, the importance of working with institution, national actor, and so on, the civil society, so the women organization, the environment. But I'm thinking now more on properly the stage of the initial response when a conflict, when a crisis hit, and when the institutions actually are collapsed, and we really talk about life-saving, which is mainly the humanitarian job, the humanitarian part of the response. We are speaking more and more about the nexus to make sure that humanitarian development and peace are really articulated properly together. But concretely, I'm thinking, can we just provide the audience, and I will contribute myself too, with concrete example, country or context or specific approaches where we were successful on doing that. I don't know if you want to build on lesson learned from a specific context or
situation. Do you have any examples you'd like to share, or is it more a call for...
I would like more
okay, very
to start
good.
with
So
a call, and
call.
yes, I'm happy to contribute more. It's not a provocation, but more like launching the...
Concrete examples of where the development and humanitarian communities, I hate saying that because they're part of the same, but actually work closely together in a positive and outcome-driven way. And you wanted to react?
I would be
Yes.
delighted to take that question. I'm very happy you asked that, and I was hoping that somebody would talk about the humanitarian aspects of all of that, which I really think that Geneva, with both its emphasis on human rights and humanitarian actors, is so important. So I won't bore you with all the details about how this works in the UN, but I think it is very clear that the humanitarian actors also have a very important role to play. And this has been a little bit difficult with some of the humanitarian actors. And basically, in a simple way, they argue peace building is political, humanitarian affairs is not political, and therefore these two cannot match. Now, that's a little bit too simplistic, I think, because everything is political. But also, there is a very important principle within the humanitarian community, and that is do no harm. And every single step that you take in a developing country, anywhere, you can change the conflict dynamics. And humanitarian actors are, within conflict, a really important group of actors. So they need to be able to be informed by a conflict analysis to avoid that they do harm. And that is, I think, it is something that we launched at the World Humanitarian Summit. It's called the Peace Promise. 31 entities within the UN and outside of the UN sign on to this. And it talks about how to do that. And of course, it needs to start with a joint analysis of what the drivers are. You need to involve local population in the design, the distribution, and the targeting of individuals. It's also, of course, I used to work for the World Food Programme, so there is no dispute about food security, saving lives. It remains the primary objective of the humanitarian community. But how you do it can actually make a difference also with regard to peace building by bringing different groups together, bringing them around to discuss the needs that are in society. And there are many examples of that where that happened. between host communities, for example, in Jordan. The Syrian refugees mostly live in the communities themselves. They don't live in refugee camps, although that also, of course, exists. They live in the towns and in the communities. So the dialogue between the refugees, the displaced people, and the host community is very important to avoid conflict. And who gets the humanitarian help? The host communities also need support and to be able to ensure that they can deliver the social services that suddenly has become increasingly in demand.
May I just interrupt you on that? Because
Yes.
I think you're touching on a very important point. I wanted to bring us all to discuss, and okay, what are the tools that help us to do no harm in certain settings and in more stable contexts? How do we ensure that we have all the parameters in place to develop sustainable policies, etc. You mentioned, the importance of analysis, the importance of including local populations in the design, etc. But you mentioned that in humanitarian settings. Is it not the same in more stable settings? Why are you making that distinction?
No, so I was getting to that.
Sorry.
The silos exist in any bureaucracy. It's nothing new to the UN. I think the success of the iPhone was because Apple, Steve Jobs, was able to break the silo between the designers and the engineers. And he said, just sit in one room and design a beautiful and a well-working machine. So it is about the Secretary General saying that we need to work together. That's one. The member states have said it. So there's a policy framework. Then to implement it, we have a lot of committees and headquarters. I won't bore you with that. But the important thing, and you were pointing to that, is how does it happen at the national level? And at the national level, it needs to be led by the resident coordinator in settings where there is no peacekeeping operation, or the special representative of the Secretary General in case there is a mission. And he or she needs to lead the analytical process. Now, in non-mission settings, there is one analytical process that is absolutely central and key, have always been the case, but there has been even more emphasis put on that through the reforms of the Secretary General. And that is what is now will be called the country analysis. It used to be called the Common Country Assessment. That country analysis, everybody needs to sit at the table. The humanitarian actors, if there are peacekeepers or political actors, they need to sit at the table. The humanitarian actors need to sit at the table. If there are employment issues and ILO is not present, they need to be able to sit at the table. If there are human rights actors, they need to sit at the table. And that is, you need to do an integrated multidimensional risk analysis that can lead to, okay, what are the drivers of violent conflict? What are the risks that we need to address? Mm-hmm. And who does what, where, and when? So it's linked also to planning. Now, you do need to do the analysis together. You don't need to do the planning together. Right. And you don't need to do the programming together. It's just that you need to work towards the same collective objectives.
Right. You're speaking there very much from a UN point. It comes across as such, as a very UN-driven, but I think that's not what you wanted to say. So
absolutely not.
Please make that clear, because I think for the audience here it's important.
This needs to be an open process that needs to, of course, involve the country, the government. It also needs to involve other stakeholders, such as civil society, the private sector, think tanks, etc. The country analysis is something that the government doesn't sign off on. So it can definitely, you need to consult the government, and it can reflect the views of the government, but they don't sign off on it. The Development Assistance Framework, which will now be called the Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, has to be signed off by the government. So what the UN will do to support the implementation of the 2030 agenda has to be fully in line with the priorities of the government, and it will be signed off by the government. But the analysis, it does not have to be signed. Mm-hmm. But it has to be open and participatory and inclusive processes.
Thank you very much. So now we're touching on different kinds of tools and measures that can be used to really ensure that we have a systemic perspective on a context, and that inadvertently we're not totally forgetting a sector or the correlations between different sectors. which in turn, inadvertently, we could be leaving a whole spectrum of society behind, right? I think that's what you're pointing at. But surely there are also other tools and measures that are being developed also already at country levels, and we'd like to hear from other stakeholders in the room also in terms of how they use also the existing data or the non-existing data. How do we tackle those issues to make sure that we really have the right perception and understanding of a context? But I think, Ali, first of all, you wanted to react, and then I see nodding around people who want to react, so that's good. I'll pass you the floor afterwards. Yes?
Yeah, again, very quickly. Francesca, thank you very much. I wanted to give, at the risk of being a little bit UN-centric again, I wanted to give an example which you may be familiar with already, but it's very close to home, which is an example of humanitarians working within the development space and doing or attempting to do exactly what Henk-Jan was talking about, which is do no harm. Humanitarians, when they come in, you know, they're a tremendous presence. The choices that people are making, often within days or hours, get locked in, sometimes for decades. Where a refugee camp gets situated can become a town, can become a city. Where the water is taken from can have a massive impact on a host community. And so one tremendous, very light tool for bringing this together is a unit within OCHA, the Joint Environment Unit, which is shared between OCHA and UN Environment. And it's a light mechanism to bring environmental expertise at that analysis stage to understanding what a humanitarian situation is. And I think of it a little bit like going on a very long hike with a compass. And if you start off and you're 5 degrees wrong on your compass bearing, after 20 kilometers, you're going to be a long way away from where you need to be. So this is a way of bringing that compass bearing back a little bit closer to that integration.
But surely, sorry to interrupt, but surely you're making again a distinction between sort of stable context and then humanitarian context, right? But how does we talk about the nexus, but how does all the data and analysis that we do in a situation of non-crisis kind of then, surely it has to trickle into the analysis of a humanitarian setting, right? I mean, the most vulnerable in a stable setting are bound to be exacerbated in the vulnerabilities in a humanitarian context, right? So how do you use already all the we don't start from scratch when suddenly there's a conflict or a disaster. We don't start from scratch, right? So what's the continuum there? Sorry for having interrupted you.
That's a really important point because, again, these different communities come in and you may have people who are new to a particular humanitarian setting who don't have that experience and you know, sort of can assume that you're starting from a clean slate. So again, what you need to do is start with the data of what there is already. Where, for example, are the toxic oil spills? I'll give you an example that you don't want to put a refugee camp on. And that's an example of where a refugee camp has been put on a toxic oil spill site. Again, with knowledge of what was there before, helps to inform the humanitarian response. And so, yeah, having the right people around the table in both the humanitarian setting and the non-humanitarian setting is really important.
All right, sorry, I just had Maria who wanted to, is it just a quick reaction to that? And then Maria and Ambassador, yes.
Context is everything. Aleppo on the siege is a totally different situation than more structural assistance to refugees in Jordan who have been there already for years.
Thank you, Maria.
Yes, I think on the humanitarian question, we are working in Syria, and we know that over 70% of the humanitarian aid is provided by women. Not women organizations, not by INGOs, not by UN OCHA, by women themselves in their communities, in besieged areas, working with their families. This is the wake-up call. We had about 200 women come here for a convening called Reclaiming the UN as a Peace Organization. And this was an essential message. The UN and the mechanisms and INGOs need to value, resource, and listen to those that are doing the humanitarian work on a day-to-day basis. And I think the question is essential because it's the same in peace societies as it is in humanitarian settings. They are the ones that are keeping their children alive, that are trying to go through the grief and situations of organizing. On the Yemen pledging conference that happened here recently, women's civil society came and they discussed this is our reality. This is what the UN needs to listen to. And it's less about the coordination bodies and the mechanisms, but how can they resource and get money to those women-led organizations doing humanitarian work at the local level. This is an essential message that I think has come through every international summit, whether it's at the local level, regional, or at other levels, that we must listen to and hear. And at the 15th anniversary of Women, Peace and Security, the UN launched the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund. And you know how much was pledged? Something like 4 million. Nothing. Nothing was pledged. This is what the reality comes to, I think, is there's a lot of normative changes, especially on women's rights as it relates to conflict, but when it comes to resourcing, there's still very little value given to what is actually happening in conflict situations.
So for people-centered responses, people have to be at the table, and the people who have to be
brings a great point, because I just heard from our colleagues in Syria, and I just wanted to make this because it's very connected. They were saying women can't get the services. These were health services, women health services in Syria, because they're not on the local governance committees. So you see the correlation with governance, institutions, exclusion, and the service provision for humanitarian. So because women aren't on the local governance, because it's a male-driven society, then they can't talk about women's rights to reproductive health care.
So what you're saying, that's the starting point to a vicious circle versus a virtuous circle, because the people who are most vulnerable to being excluded from solutions and policies are not at the table from the outset. It sounds so obvious, yet we know that this doesn't just happen out of the blue. Ambassador, you wanted to react, and then Henk-Jan, sir, I haven't forgotten you. I'll come back to you with your question in a second.
Thank you very much. It's just because mention by a number of speakers, I think two was made to refugees, and I would be talking about our experience with regard to through the water lens in this regard. Well, you know, first, yes, refugees have been for many years, but actually we started receiving refugees since 1948. We've had more than 6 waves, and the most recent is the Syrian crisis. But the last 15 years, we've received around 500,000 Iraqis and 1.3 million Syrian refugees. And if you link this to the actual situation, water situation in Jordan, second poorest in terms of freshwater resources, individual water share for an individual is at one point, 2013 was 1.3 cubic meters. Today it's less than 100, and it's 10% below actually the poverty line of water, the water deficit of 400 million cubic tons. The fact that 80% of our water that we use and drink comes from groundwater aquifers, and that in 10 years' time our aquifers will be empty. The fact that there are models basically showing that because of climate change, water resources will decline by 30% in 15 years. The fact that, and despite all that, I can go on forever, talk about topography difficulties that it has, the fact that we actually bring water from one place to another, and the most recent 1.3 million that came to Jordan, and the difficulties this has placed. And what has this meant for us? Of course, we used our own groundwater reserves to provide for these refugees. And yes, the camp probably was not on an oil spill, but was actually on actual groundwater reserve for Jordan, which is really very unfortunate. But still, we did our best to ensure that refugees, whether they are in local communities or in the different camps that were established, some of them very hastily because we were receiving like 5,000 per day and needed to work on these issues, we ensured that these refugees were basically receiving water and sanitation services, both in camps and where they are. This was not easy. We had to work with partners, with donors, with international organizations, with UNICEF, with even the ICRC that was filling the gap, providing water services and water to refugees, basically where they are. We included refugees as well as local society, local communities, in also the through community-based initiatives and projects that came out of the box, either through rain harvesting or using of grey water and so on and so forth. And the government itself undertook to look at a more efficient way of supplying water, rehabilitate infrastructure that was there, sanitation as well as water delivery, rehabilitate wells, drill new wells, and so on and so forth. How we did this? It's relatively at a high cost and with support of many people, and through plans. Through assessment. We were talking about assessing needs of local communities, be they Jordanian and vulnerable situations where they're receiving the refugee communities and the refugees themselves. And we have done quite a number of achievements in this regard. Needs are there, obstacles and predicaments and difficulties and challenges are still there. But the fact is that we all worked together, and we worked on a dual aspect. And this also goes to the question that was raised on the development issue. We worked from a humanitarian perspective, yes, providing humanitarian needs, immediate needs of the refugees, but for a longer-term assistance that will, at the same time, bring benefit for the local communities themselves, because of the tensions that were so rightly referred to between the local communities that were not in better position themselves in terms of resource of water. Water they used to receive once a week, they were receiving now once every 4 weeks. So how do you convince people that you have to share the water you have? They have to see that they too are benefiting from whatever assistance that was provided. In short, the difficult, precarious water scarcity in Jordan is a big challenge, continues to be a challenge, but we opted to find different ways of ensuring that we do not leave the refugees, as well as the most vulnerable in our societies, from the right to access to adequate water and sanitation. And that was done through very close collaboration between the international community, international organizations, as well as donor states and other international NGOs.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that very concrete example. And so bringing all stakeholders around the table, I know you wanted to react, you'd asked for the floor before, but I'd just like to throw a question out there. We have another 10 minutes in this conversation, and I think one that has been coming up on Slido is, okay, if all stakeholders need to be represented to make sure that we have the right approaches that embrace all potential sources of vulnerability, what about the corporate world? What's the role of businesses also in all these different settings, whether they're pre, during, or post-conflict, in stable, non-stable? What is the role there of the private sector in this equation? And what are your experiences in managing also the drivers of the incentives of the private sector in this mega calculation we so desperately need to get right? So that's an open question to all of you for any reactions. But Henk-Jan, you wanted to react first to which point was it you wanted to relate?
Well, I wanted to say something about similar as what Maria was talking about the importance of participation of women and young people. We have two big policy frameworks that is driving these. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda, both coming out of the Security Council. And in particular, on the participation of women, we have very strong evidence because there was a good study done in 2015 around the 15th anniversary of Resolution 1325, that meaningful participation in women in peace processes leads to much more sustainable peace. So a reduction of the risk by 20% after 2 years and by 35% after 15 years. So, and I think it's particularly important that it's not only something that women say about women, but that also men say that about women. The other framework that the Secretary General created is a 7-point action plan around gender-responsive peace building. And Maria mentioned a couple of areas that are in there, women's participation in delivery of social services, women's participation in elected and appointed positions, women's participation in planning, and a 15% target of making sure that all UN funding in conflict settings devotes at least 15% to women's empowerment and gender equality as a principal objective. And the Peacebuilding Fund actually reached 36% last year. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just make that particular point, which is, of course, very much related to my point about inclusion. I'm happy to say something about the private sector.
Corporates, yes. Well, I think, Federico, did you want to respond to that? Okay, so Henk-Jan, we'll take your input on the role of corporate, and then I'll pass it to you.
I think the role of the private sector is very central. The member states also have recognized that in the Sustaining Peace resolutions, but we are running very, very far behind in engaging with them, in particular on peace issues. And of course, we know that they can lead to conflict, in particular around extractives. I mean, maybe Ollie can say a little bit more about a number of initiatives around, what is it called? The Extractive Industry Initiative, but also pay as you, what is it called again? Pay as you, publish what you pay. So that those are very important. But we have also engaged the private sector through the Peacebuilding Fund, in particular to have dialogue mechanisms around extractive industries. In Colombia, we're doing something very innovative, and I think we need to do much, much more in that area, is trying to get the private sector investing in areas where the FARC was very active, where they would normally not invest because it's too remote, the market is too small, and we need to really engage with them. The other thing that I think needs to happen, we need more norms and standards around peace. We have a lot of norms and standards around human rights, the Global Compact and corruption and labor standards, etc., but nothing around peace. So that is one thing that needs to happen, and I think we need to engage them much more in terms of what impact they have themselves on peace processes or peace outcomes at the country.
Sorry, on norms, sorry, it wasn't very clear to me. Norms and standards on peace, what do you mean by that?
So, I mean, there's frameworks around private sector and human rights.
Related to private sector
exactly,
engagement.
And there is frameworks around labor standards, which is all part of the Global Compact, on corruption, on making it transparent what you pay to the government in terms of royalties. But there's nothing around how the private sector contributes to conflict or to peaceful outcomes. And I think we need to establish some global norms and standards, for example, including dialogue mechanisms with the local population when you are operating in a particular area, dialogues about who's getting the jobs, and are you bringing people from the outside?
So are those not norms and standards that are related to the SDGs? Isn't it like two sides of the same?
They can be very much tied to the SDGs, and I think there's actually Peace Nexus, a foundation based in Geneva, is thinking about that, how the private sector should report on how they contribute to Goal 16.
And I think more broadly than Goal 16, that's my point, is that I think the sort of conversation that's happening a lot in Geneva and beyond is how can we get the private sector accountable and measure its contribution, both positive and negative, not only to SDG 16, but the entire agenda, right? And I think that's an open question, and But 16 is so related to all the others. I just have this, in the lab, we're so obsessive with the integrated nature of the agenda that we always get a little bit nervous when we talk just about one SDG. But I get your point, obviously, it's related to so many others. But that framework of impact, how to measure impact of corporate on delivering on Agenda 2030 is still a huge open question. Federico, sorry, I'm a bit tired, so your name.
No problem. Yeah, building on what has been just said, and I alluded to it earlier, so the role of the private sector. You know, if we do want to create employment in fragile situations, we basically have two options. Just making it very simple. Either we work on public employment programs, or we contribute, we invite, we enable the environment for the private sector to invest. And when we talk about private sector, of course, we have immediately the tendency of thinking about exclusively multinational enterprises, especially in the extractive sector. But we can also, and we should also think about the micro-entrepreneur, the small enterprise, the cooperatives. All this is an investment that can be done at country level, that can themselves create decent job opportunities, that they are themselves contributing to the peace. So a major effort should still be done around this topic, with the involvement, again, of the Chamber of Commerces at country level to stay concrete, you know. To the organization of employers when they need stronger capacity, providing them those capacity in order to work on sustainability, even while, to respond to the colleague of OCHA, Francesca, even, and it goes without saying that in humanitarian operation, first and foremost is life-saving operation, basic social services to be provided, but without waiting for the conditions, you know, that to be there, but really contributing to create the condition to enable national investment, for instance, in areas that they are fragile, they are less accessible because of insecurity, because of other reasons. As soon as the conditions are feasible, are in place, accompany them, because the longer term, the sustainability of our intervention can only be done if jobs are at the end created by national micro, small enterprises. And as far as the multinational enterprises are concerned, of course, our work is to ensure that, first of all, there is the respect of the corporate social responsibility, but not only, that they do create employment. So pro-employment involvement of multinational enterprises. This can really make a difference. And not employment only of the completely unskilled labor, but also having a longer-term program for skilling nationals. So these are, in several fragile situations, areas where we could massively invest, and the term investment, I think it is the right one because it takes time, but we should start from there. And this is definitely a contribution of the world of work to peace that we should aim to.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, you wanted to react? We have another 5 minutes, so
I'll be very quick, but the role of private sector, I think, is very important, especially those big entities that are willing to invest in peace and development in areas where needed. And I just want to point to another example for Jordan. We committed to provide work for 200,000 refugees in Jordan on the basis that we have access to the wider access to the European market, for instance, and facilitating A rules of origins, investing in our economic zones so that the investments generate enough funds to allow us to create new jobs. And the most recent conference that took place in London was basically just to generate enough and interest in investing in Jordan in a way that would benefit, of course, the refugees, but also the community. Private sector has a lot to offer, have a lot of funds, and if we can generate these funds to things that can help people have a better life and help states basically deal with the challenges they are facing, including that of displacement, I think we can make the world a better place.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm looking at the room just to see whether there are any more burning questions you'd like to bring up. Yes, sir. Last question for you. Do you have it? Yes, please.
Merci beaucoup. I am a survival of indigenous people of colonization, Spanish colonization. The question, for me, it's very important question to sustain peace and the sustainable development. It is long time discussed during the many conferences. Last time in Johannesburg conference on sustainable development. Do you remember? What happened with the shoot a berry? Up the break Berlin Mur, up the shoot of socialism. Socialism of United Soviet Union. What happened? The mundo fell in the violence, in the guerra. The Western country bombed the...
Sir, we have another 30 seconds to end your question. I think I know where you're going, and I'll bring it as a concluding question.
The Libya, Serbia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and today Syria. Tomorrow, maybe it's possibly Venezuela.
Sir, we need to wrap up. Thank you. Right. Sorry, I think
you're not interested because it is objective, political, fundamental question.
So what are we going to do? Thank you. I think I'd like to finish on your point.
The transnational corporation possesses all the natural resources of the world. The humanity lives without resources. The resource, natural resource, is finished in the world. It is not existent.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll finish on that note, which brings to a point which I had in mind the whole time. I think the gentleman here made the correlation between, it's been a long-standing conversation that we've had for years, right? How are we going to have a more equal development process in the world? How are we going to sustain development? How are we going to prevent peace? This is not a new question. I think that was his point. So what is it today, in your closing remarks, each and one of you? What is, in your view, I'd like to finish on a positive note. What gives us hope today? What is different today? What are we going to do differently today, or that we're already doing differently, that gives you hope that this agenda is not only a development agenda, but is also a peace agenda? What are we doing differently today that you feel is giving us hope that with this agenda, we're going to not only reach the development goals, but allow for a more stable and conflict-free world? A bit of a complex question to end, but I'd like you to I'll give you 1 minute each to finish on that, not beyond, don't go on a tangent. I'll be very strict. Please, Federico.
Thank you. In the past years, we have been working with PBSO, the World Bank, and UNDP on employment program for peace. So we are adding to the regular implementation of the employment program specific drivers that may facilitate the peace outcome of the program. These drivers are providing opportunity to the beneficiary of the program, providing contact among the beneficiary of the program, and trying to reduce the grievances that they may exist in the area where the program is implemented.
Thank you very much.
So we are doing this in a way that we consider employment program almost as an activity to lead to peace. So this is the change that we are trying to implement. It was difficult in a minute, sorry.
Thank you very much. No, that's an excellent response, yes?
So what gives me hope is that we're starting to measure. We're starting to measure progress. And the SDGs is all about measuring progress. What is a challenge is that we still don't have enough data with which to measure. So we have the targets, we have the indicators. Of those 270-odd indicators, 93 are environment-related indicators, and still 2/3 of those indicators we don't have enough data to know whether we're doing well, whether we're doing badly, or whether we're in the same place. But at least we're starting to measure.
Wonderful. Thank you.
What gives me hope, actually, is that we have this 2030 agenda that includes peace and justice issues and focuses on inclusion and is still people-centered. And youth gives me a really hope. I mean, we have seen through the Youth, Peace and Security study an enormous potential, an enormous range of activities of young people working for peace around the world. And I think together we can reach those goals.
Thank you. Maria?
What gives me hope is, I think building what you said is movements, is the connection with movements, the young students protesting the climate. Like, yes, gives me hope. The Syrian women who came together and formed a Syrian women's political movement at a time of endless discussion and debate around the conflict. Or WILF just launched 2 weeks ago, Korea Peace Now, a movement bringing together women's groups from around the world to look at ending a 70-year conflict on the Korean peninsula. So definitely the energy is in the movements, on the streets. I think this gives me hope.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Thank you. What gives me hope is that basically there is an international consensus on the SDGs themselves, both at state level and at civil society level. We all believe that they need to be implemented, and also the fact that within them are the tools that will assist us in implementing, including goal number 17, which allows for resources to be provided, and the fact that many states are or have actually reported on a voluntary mechanism and are taking it seriously. And I think this only goes to show how important these goals are. We need to keep up the fight, basically, and the motivation to ensure that 2030 we will indeed have implemented these goals.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much to all speakers for having come this afternoon and having been so outspoken on the basis of your expertise, but also allowing me to nudge you a little bit beyond your sectors of expertise. I want to thank also the audience. I think it's very difficult to sum up such a conversation. I think it deserves a whole new era of conversation, but I think we really one message that came up over and over again is this notion of inequalities as a driver of disputes, right to the spectrum, you were saying, right, the spectrum from dispute to conflict, and how fundamental it is to really address those inequalities. But then we also really touched on how do you identify those pockets of inequalities. It could be that we think that inequalities are really here, but when they could be also in other sectors. And this brought us to the importance of having the right stakeholders around the table, ensuring that no stakeholder is left behind, right? Maria, you were really making a strong point on that. And then the notion of measuring our impact, both for as much as from the public sector, as much as for the private sector. And then I really liked ending on this note of why is it that today there are reasons for hope that this time we will move forward. And I note here the fact that there's an identification of there's a new identification of new drivers. They may not be new, but the fact that we're identifying a whole variety of different drivers of inequalities and that then drive conflict is something new. That we all want to measure impact. We're not quite there yet, but there's really a common will and drive to measure impact. The role of youth and of movement, so the voice of civil society that's going to keep us all accountable. And then the notion also that, Ambassador, you mentioned the notion of partnership, SDG 17 really being one of the goals that so many stakeholders are holding up. And last but not least, the fact that so many countries on a voluntary basis are agreeing to go to New York to share with their peers what's working and what's not working when it comes to the implementation of the SDGs is indeed, in my view, too, a very positive sign. So on this note, I'd like to also thank PBSO again for partnering on this event, for coming all the way from New York to be with us. Thank you all to the different speakers. I'd like to thank again the UN Library for hosting us in this beautiful room, thanking you all for having made it here. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our colleague behind the camera there for having spared his time to help us to record this event today, which will be on our websites probably tomorrow in the next few days. Last but not least, thank you also to all the colleagues from the library that have been working on a sort of a list of resources, of readings that may be of interest to all of you to dig a little bit deeper on the matter that we discussed this afternoon. It's available on the library's website, and it'll also be available on the website of the SDG Lab, sdglab.ch. All right, I think I haven't forgotten anything. I'm looking at my team. They're all nodding. That's a good sign. I'd like to thank you very much and wish you a wonderful afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you in the next iteration of So What. Thank you.